Back in 2019, a mountaineer named Nimsdai Persia took a photo of Everest that got a lot of attention.
This photo shows the queues of people ascending Everest.
Climbing Everest has become dangerously popular.
New video this morning of that line to reach the top of the world.
In this video, we're going to uncover what happened that day on Everest, and why queues on the mountain are a sign that travel might just be about to change forever. To understand why people are queuing at the summit of Everest, there are a few things you need to know about the mountain. And the first is really quite obvious. Queuing on Everest is incredibly dangerous. Not because of the 700-meter sheer rock faces, or the risk of avalanches, or the high winds. Although yes, all of those things are dangerous. But what really makes queuing at the summit scary has to do with the altitude, or specifically the lack of oxygen at altitude. At 8,000 meters, you're getting about a third of the oxygen you get at sea level. Legendary mountaineer David Brashears described the feeling as breathing through a straw while running on a treadmill. Your decision-making is impaired. The risk of your brain swelling and lungs filling with water increases with every minute. This is why they call the altitude at 8,000 meters the death zone, because once you're in it, you're dying. This brings us to the second problem. There really isn't a lot of space on Everest. There are 20 known routes up the mountain, but 18 of these are deemed so technically difficult that most commercial expeditions don't really consider them as options. And that forces everyone up just two routes, the South Col and the North Ridge. If someone has a medical issue or is moving slowly, then it creates a bottleneck, backing up the queue for hours. Then there is the issue of time, because you can't summit Everest whenever you want. Weather conditions mean there are about 15 days a year where summiting Everest is possible. Most of these days occur in May. The problem is that bad weather can shrink that window to just a few days, meaning everyone summits at the same time. The dangers of the mountain. The space and time available to summit are fixed, immovable limits. Now, back when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's first summited Everest, these limits didn't matter, and that is because only the world's most elite climbers would attempt Everest. But then, in the late 1980s, the Nepali government opened the mountain to commercial expeditions, and demand skyrocketed. Before 1990, there had only been 300 successful summits of the mountain, and since that time, there have been over 12,000. As demand to summit Everest grew, so did the sizes of the groups summiting in a single day. Before 2010, there had never been a group of more than 150 people successfully summiting Everest in a single day. But since that time, it's happened on 13 occasions. Far from being a one-off, queues on Everest are becoming the norm. Essentially, demand for Everest is beginning to reach a point where it's testing or even exceeding the limits of what is physically possible on the mountain. So why does this matter for the rest of travel and tourism? Well, because the phenomenon of our love of travel exceeding the limits of what a destination can cope with is an increasingly common occurrence in tourism. In fact, there are examples of it happening all over the world. It's become so common that the travel and tourism industry gave it a name.
Overtourism. Overtourism.
Overtourism. Becoming really concerned about overtourism.
Google searches for the term exploded in 2024, as destinations grappled with a flood of tourists in what would become a record-breaking year for the travel and tourism industry. So, just how big a problem is overtourism? Right now, less than 5% of the world's population can afford to take a vacation. That's about 400 million people. But over the next 25 years, in a single generation, that number is set to double to 800 million people. Far from being at some sort of peak tourism, this is just the start for the travel and tourism industry. So, how do you manage this seemingly unstoppable force? Well, some destinations are already beginning to take action. Authorities in Kyoto are considering limiting tourists from certain parts of the city. Venice banned cruise ships from entering the old city. And Amsterdam have now just actively decided to ask certain tourists not to visit. Those queues on Everest mark a new era for travel and tourism. One where an unstoppable force collides against an immovable object. And what governments and the travel industry decide to do next is going to shape how, where, and when we travel. If the industry continues with business as usual, it sticks its head in the sand and pretends like everything's just fine, then destinations are going to end up feeling more like theme parks than cultural experiences. Crowds will get worse, queues will get longer, and anti-tourism sentiment will grow, as will the size of the protests. But if we start taking carrying capacity seriously, then we can preserve destinations for future generations and get money into the lesser known places, many of which are yet to benefit from visitor expenditure. In the end, it may just come down to how long we as tourists are willing to put up with the queues. In the death zone on Everest, and just about everywhere else. If you want to discover the hidden destinations and how to be a better tourist, or are just curious about the weird and wonderful world of tourism data, then please like, subscribe, and follow for more, because we have a ton more content coming like this. Thanks so much for watching.